So in the last session, you saw a lot of the intellectual work from the FOCUS Consortium and how it came together in 2 or 3 different proposals as how some of the risks and challenges, particularly on the financial side for these durable therapies, might be addressed. At MIT, we just don't think, we also like to do. We say at MIT New Digs, we're a think and do tank, and the MIT logo, if you recall, is one that's both hammer and book, right? So it's both constructing things as well as thinking about them. But we're an open community, and to demonstrate that, as we talk about these focus pilots, our moderator for this is actually Rena Conti from Boston University, not from MIT, woohoo, for all that. And so Rena, can you bring us together on this panel?
Yes, thank you. First, I want to say thank you so much to Mark, to MIT, and to New Digs for putting together this fantastic day. Really thinking hard about truly a new era of medicine that is going to bring real cures to suffering patients and their families is very exciting for all of us, and thinking hard about how we're going to finance them and make sure that they're sustainable and accessible to patients is incredibly important. This panel is really going to build on the previous one. We're going to talk about some pilots that are being done in the commercial payer space, but also in the public payer space. We have a slight change in speakers. And so from what you see on the program, so I'm going to let my speakers introduce themselves. They're going to have very brief comments, and then we're going to open it up for brief questions. Jane?
Great, thank you. So I'm Jane Barlow. I'm a physician by training, and my background is on the payer side. So I've spent time at IBM as a large self-insured employer managing benefits. I was at Medco Health Solutions and then CVS Health prior to this. So I've been working with the MIT group since, I guess, really the inception of the project, and trying to bring sort of the payer voice to this. So as we know that there's great innovation, and we have patients and providers that are anxious to use these, that accessibility issue lies largely with payers. So we went out early on to talk to payers about this in sort of a systematic fashion, surveying them to say what were the obstacles. And you've heard many tidbits about that today as we've talked through the different panels. But just to put sort of a fine point on it, when you've seen a payer, you've seen a payer, right? And it's a managed Medicaid payer functions differently than a state Medicaid payer. A self-insured employer, different than commercial. A lot has to do with how they manage risk in their population, as well as the regulatory constraints. But the piece that I just want to emphasize one other time here is that the size does matter a lot. And the actuarial risk for a small payer is huge because they would, when you project the numbers on some of these very small conditions, have just fractions of patients, and that's hard for them to price in their premiums versus a very large payer who will expect to get patients. They'll adjust their premiums. And it's all about making sure that you, one, cover what needs to be covered to be competitive and attractive, but also not to cover things others aren't covering so you don't get adverse selection. So you want to try to keep an even playing field. And then the small payer has to charge competitive premiums, all right? They have less capital to backstop that. So this idea of payer segmentation plays through all of this, and I think is sort of a backstop for how we ended up where we are today with the pilots.
Thank you. Lovena.
Get on. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
I think you should go now.
Okay, Lovena Chaput. I presently work for AveXis. I've been in the biopharmaceutical industry for quite a long time, but the last 10 years I spent in the rare orphan disease space. And the reason that's important is it's really all about the patient for me and what drives me every day to do what I do. And I look forward to serving on this panel. Do we start?
Yeah, go ahead. Start.
So I'm going to introduce you a little bit to SMA and just the gene therapy that we're working on. The first thing I have to do is give you a disclosure that this is an investigational product and it's not been approved by the FDA based on safety and efficacy. So from there, we'll keep going. Basically, SMA is the leading cause of infant death. And until I actually joined AveXis, I was not aware of that. But 1 in 10,000 live births, these babies have SMA. SMA is actually a spectrum disease. You can either hear it based on type or copy number. The most important thing is we're really going to be focused on the type 1 indication because it's based on disease onset. And these babies start to develop motor neuron loss at birth, sometimes intrautero, and 60% of those births, the 1 in 10,000, actually have SMA type 1. The videos don't work, so I'm going to just kind of walk through what these pictures represent. So type 1, that infant that you see there. Oh, did it? Oh, it's working. So you'll see as the physician works with this child, they're very floppy, and there's no head control. He actually has to lift that baby's head up to support that child. This child with type 1 will never sit, and only 8% of the children born with type 1 will be alive at 20 months of age. So it's very rapidly progressive and it's devastating. If we look at the type 2, the signs and symptoms of this, they come to effect later in life, but by the time they're about 12 months of age, they're going to have symptoms. The most important thing here is these children can never walk without assistance. And then the type 3 girl that you see on the far not sure my left, I think. She has a significant difficulty getting up, and she will lose the ability to walk over time. So you can see that it's a progressive disease no matter what type it is. So now let's go into ZOLGENSMA just very briefly. It's a one-time gene replacement therapy, and all of our children have survived. So remember I said at 20 months, only 8% of these children are alive if untreated. The most important thing is all but one of our children has met the milestone of sitting, the milestone that no type 1 child ever meets. By sitting, these children can actually perform daily functions. They can go to school, they can engage. All of these children have normal cognition, if not higher. The other thing is, based on our long-term trial, we have to watch and observe these patients over 15 years. We continue to see developmental milestones. We do have 2 walkers, and we've had 2 additional standards now based on the long-term data. The other thing that's really important to families is for these children to be able to speak. All of our children are speaking. Normally these children never speak. And then they're also feeding orally. So most of these children, all but 2 have been taken off G-tubes, et cetera, allowing them to feed normally. Bottom line is we're going to continue to observe these patients through registries once we're in the commercial setting. I'm going to turn it over to Michael now and share why we're so interested in this pilot.
Thank you, Lovena, and Michael Sherman, Harvard Pilgrim Healthcare, and really good to be with all of you, and sitting next to Lovena, with whom I've had some really good discussions over the past year now, and frankly, I've been in discussions with many companies over the past year or 2 which are trying to get in early, but after hearing some of the comments before about those who think that might be illegal, I'm reluctant to name them, even though I think they should be really commended for coming in early and sitting down and brainstorming and saying, we've got these expensive gene therapies coming out there, we don't want access to be a problem, let's talk about what we can do. And although if you read the press, you might think that we all don't like each other very much, and maybe kind of in theory that may be true, when you sit down with the individuals on the other side and look at the videos and understand where they're coming from and have that shared true north of treating the patients, you end up putting that past you and thinking about solutions. So in the spirit of solutions, what we decided to do is get together and decide, can we do something around portability that can allow a multi-year and enable a multi-year agreement? And just to make things a little more confusing, my organization has self-insured individuals who are not part of this, and we're in 4 states, and 3 of them are not part of this pilot. So we're actually in 2 different discussions with companies like AveXis about both memberships, which again, it gets complicated for us as well. But the point is that we realize that there's a benefit to paying over time, given the budget impact, given unknowns about the durability, and given about our desire to better align what's paid with actual true outcomes. And it's challenging to do that, as you've heard, in a system where there's portability, where there's mobility among individuals. And it did occur to us that, using, again, this is an example that could, in theory, expand. If you think about churn as leaving my health plan, it is that's material, but if you think of it as leaving the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, it's probably a lot lower. And the thought is, can we get together the stakeholders, the other private payers in Massachusetts, which we've done, developers like AveXis, and then patients and providers, and think, how do we create a system, an enabling approach and framework for doing this over multiple years? So our goal is to, again, design and test a multi-year annuity with performance-based measures, figure out the process and how the contracting works and how we address patient movement. And again, that freedom to operate piece, we'll talk more about that in terms of the challenges, because there are structural barriers that we need to overcome to make this as effective as it could be. This is just a straw man that we put together, and I'll just point out, it's a busy slide, I'll point out a couple of pieces here. The goal here, and it could be any number of payments or years, but we're looking at 5 payments with the first one on day 1. So it's actually a 4-year pilot, not a 5-year pilot. It took a lot of really smart MIT quantitative types a few months to actually figure that out, but because we used to say it was 5 years. It is 4 years, but that's nothing. But so the point is that it is over time, commensurate with ongoing results, and you see the performance metric line as being TBD, and we are in active discussions. I also want to point out that the provider payments are basically health plan specific. In other words, we have contracts with providers, so do our competitors. Those are unaffected. We pay the providers as we would normally. And in terms of the patient deductible, cost share, et cetera, and this is something where my own personal belief is that if, certainly if it's priced fairly and we want people to get these, there shouldn't be a material cost share, if anything. Because this isn't about putting cost share in place to get people to get a different drug, which is one of the goals. This is about the fact they need it, and we shouldn't create artificial barriers to their getting it. And in terms of the amount of dollars they would pay, it's immaterial given the total cost of the drug. But so we're all keeping our existing plan designs. I'd also point out that it's 0% after the first year, because we don't think it's ethical to use a multi-year payment as a way to get individuals to pay more than they would have under a typical one-payment agreement. Again, we are looking at where do we collaborate and where do we do things ourselves. We would collaborate as around the eligibility criteria. We're intending treatment to label, assuming that the FDA doesn't do anything really surprising. But if they do what we expect and what AveXis expects, that's the intent, be for the commercial fully insured population. Similar payment structure, which is the slide we just showed you over a certain number of payments, and agree on common performance metrics. So we would all agree what constitutes success, what constitutes failure. And then thinking about the patient mobility payments, essentially we're all agreeing that if a member/patient from one of the other health plans in the agreement comes to us, the liability comes with them. And if they go from us to another payer in the agreement, the liability goes in the other direction, which seems fair and gives us a mechanism for dealing with a multi-year agreement in a non-single payer system. Some plan-specific elements. And again, we have to be really careful, as you might imagine, with a lot of antitrust supervision in the room to keep all of us out of trouble. But the price of the therapeutic is, in theory, plan-specific. In practice, particularly for therapeutics where there's not a lot of competition, I don't think the companies are going to be offering different prices, but in theory they could. We all have our own provider networks and reimbursement, and our own plan designs, as I mentioned, with respect to the member benefit and cost sharing, et cetera. In terms of what happens when an individual goes to a non-participating plan, that is up to the health plans involved. In theory, it could be you just pay the balance due, or if you're going to try to be aggressive and track the patient anyway, which you might be able to, and this is what we did with our Sparkle Extern agreement, you could still be on the other side of the agreement, but that's up to each payer. And then their own internal operational pieces, the medical policies, managing the program, et cetera, is all plan specific. Here's a very simple slide looking at the patient and showing that if they were the first payer, it's based on that payer's contract. And if they go to a second payer, the liability together with the payment terms move along with the member. Again, this is fairly simple operationally. It does protect information which might be proprietary to any given health plan, and it helps maintain the competition that we all want to see continued. In terms of some of the implementation challenges, which are real, despite everyone's, I think, best of intentions, and we all are spending time every week at the table on this. One is price reporting for AMP and for Medicaid best pricing, and again, the best pricing is a concern. Without it, the pharma companies, whether it's AveXis or any of them, are going to limit what they're willing to go at risk for, and I don't blame them in this regard. So we need to figure out how do we work within the construct in a way that serves the purpose of the pilot. Second, having practical metrics which we can easily get and which we've all agreed to. The metrics, again, are something that we are in active discussion on, and as always I found out it's always more complicated than you think it will be. In theory, you look at what's, what has been used for the approval, and I found in many agreements, the company explains, here's why that's not practical. There's no way in hell this visual test, for example, is going to work when you leave the academic center. So that comes up more and more. Patient mobility tracking. We're not used to thinking of where the patient goes when they leave Harvard Pilgrim, and as well as other payers. So that's an issue. Putting together a scalable approach, and this is really important. So we're at the table with AveXis, but again, this is not just about AveXis. They happen to have what we expect to be the next approved product. This is about creating a framework that we could use for any company that wants to come in and play by the set of rules and work with us. And then specifically regarding AveXis, we have a compressed timeline, only a few months until the expected launch. Can we get this together given some of the challenges that I mentioned? So I'll pass it on to John and look forward to the Q&A.
Thank you.
Thanks, Michael.
Michael.
Thanks very much, Michael. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm John Glasspool. I'm an advisor to MIT New Digs, and I became involved in this area when developing drugs for hemophilia and looking at both gene editing as well as gene treatment. And what was very clear to me at that time, we were very excited from the science, but we also said the healthcare system may not be ready for this. And so my job as the head of corporate strategy at that time was, can we work on making sure that if the science is there, can we make sure the patients will get access? Michael's obviously taking you through one which is focused on the private payers, and in this one I'm going to take you through the milestone-based contract with public payers. Why do we do that? If we look at these diseases, Jane talked about segmentation of payers. When we think about segmenting the diseases that these therapies may address, many of the patients that will be eligible and deserve to get these therapies will be in the public payment system. And so we felt that was particularly important to make sure we also address that. This to me is the most important slide, at least for me conceptually, as to why this group of durable therapies is different from all of the other therapies I at least personally have worked on. In that, what we essentially see is there is an acute intervention point, but we're anticipating that there is a huge accrual of benefit. Compared with all the other therapies that I've personally worked on, where essentially the acute cost point and the therapy benefit move in parallel. And that's what's very, very different. And that difference then sets up at least how I think about value overall, and we've thought about value as a team, not in price setting, but how do we think? And I want to reinforce one thing here from the previous panel. As we talk about benefits, 21st century cures did allow for patient-centered drug design. So I would encourage all of you in the room that are either working with companies, you are a company, you're a developer, to actually undertake patient-centered drug design. Clearly, we're at the sort of a point where we're trying to break the cycle. A key cycle break that we will have is as we understand what's important to patients, what the value driver will be. If we can capture that early on in our drug development programs and our gene therapy programs, we'll actually be able to use scales and measurements that enable these things to occur actually much more effectively. So this is a very simple piece. What is value? It's benefits minus costs. However, there are two very important variants to this, which is the delta on benefits and the delta on costs. That's true with any therapy, but it's obviously particularly true here where we're talking about durability, the durability of which is somewhat unknown. And on the cost side, there may be emergent side effects which have a significant impact on value. And so this is the basis between that acute cost and durability of benefits, and then how we think about value, led us to really think about the development of a milestone-based contract with public payers. This is a much shorter time frame, obviously, than Michael's pilot on the annuity side. And the reason being, and you heard the earlier speakers allude to this, the public payment side is very much in 1 year blocks. Now, we think we can stretch that a little bit in the 12 to 18 months. But that's the key element, that we're trying to shrink what we do in terms of making sure we can get access and people still feel that they have enough certainty on the value that I described on the prior page. The Medicare best price is something that we're particularly interested in. Michael came to it from the commercial side. What we're working on here is, can we do state-based state plan amendments to actually take out, by contracting directly with the state, we actually take out these agreements from the best price. So enable the state to get the benefit and not risk the Medicaid best price. Earlier speakers talked about the anti-kickback. We want to make sure within this pilot process that we're very clear that by being upfront, by the contractual terms being laid out, like Senator Cassidy said, what is the criteria for the patient, making sure all these things are Loctite in the contract to ensure that's there and very clear. We want to make sure that we look at these things on ASP and AMP. An additional point, particularly when we come into therapies where there may be some significant cost offsets, such as hemophilia, what is the potential impact on 340B? A key element that you've heard across the day is the tracking of milestones. I started my career early on really looking at the sort of deep science and being fascinated by the deep science. What I've learned through my career, particularly now that I'm more responsible for the later stages, to link what do we understand about the biology, what do we need to study in the clinical development program, but what do we need to then turn that into to make somebody like Michael feel very comfortable that we're developing the value. So we have a process we're laying out to link biology, clinical trials outcomes, and claims outcomes in order to make these things easier to implement. And of course, as much as we've done over the last couple of years to work on this, I am certain, as with all things, we will find additional barriers that we're elucidating during this process. So that's the overview from the MBC, and back to you for the questions.
Thank you. So I have a couple of prepared questions, and then I'm going to open it up to the audience. So across both of these pilots, we've mentioned in passing providers and provider networks, but I'm curious, how does payment and also provider involvement happen in both of these pilots? How do you make sure that providers are going to participate? And also, how does that address provider metrics related to quality and other things that are being reported either at the state level or across payers in other ways?
So maybe I'll take a first stab at that. So a great question. And I will add that I think about 80% of our provider payments are actually tied to value already, along the spectrum from full risk to fee-for-service, chassis with add-on payments. So they're already used to looking at measures that impact their population. And to the extent that we can actually do something value-based on the drug side, because the drugs actually feed into their own value-based agreements, they're really happy to work with us. I think the important thing here is also to make sure that they're comfortable with the outcome measures and can adequately fulfill, that they can measure and they can share the information with us, either through EHRs or claims or some other mechanism, and that they're scientifically valid.
So just to be clear, in this setting, the drugs are on budget for the providers, correct?
They, in theory, are. We actually haven't discussed it with them yet because there are outlier provisions. And depending on how the agreements are structured, it's provider-specific, some of them might be triggered. So it's unclear how it'll be treated, particularly in something which is fairly low in terms of the end, but a high dollar value. But it is provider agreement specific.
Thank you. And for your pilot?
Yeah, on the side of our pilot, we want to make sure that we're looking, again, somewhat differently as to making sure that where we're structuring the risk and the risk sharing, is the provider appropriately rewarded? Do they decide within that system to take part in that risk sharing, or should they be managed separately? And that's obviously a key outcome. I think one of the key things that we've been very much focused on at Focus is ensuring that what we develop is sustainable for all parts of the system. And I think a key difference for me, I've spent much of my career looking at different things in silos, is that interaction and making sure that is everybody appropriately rewarded to enable that patient access. And so that's a key element that we're keen on there. I think the other key factor is to ensure that as we start to think about capturing outcomes for these therapies, and it was alluded to on the earlier panel, there's going to be a lot of long-term follow-up on these gene therapies, and to make sure that we're not just thinking of the traditional risk in safety terms, but we start to really move towards risk-benefit and capturing those longer-term benefits as well, which will continually reinforce, one, the benefit overall, but also feed future innovation.
And then for payment, in the annuity payment model, it will require a third party to administer it and to also help track. So we found that tracking these patients is really critical. We can do that through registries, through the payer side can help us as well as the hub. But long term, we have to have a third party administer the payment model.
That makes sense. And then in terms of outcomes, tell us a little bit more specifically about how you are defining outcomes in the pilots. To what extent are they really consonant with what the label is going to say, approved by the FDA? And to what extent are you going to be collecting real-world outcomes that will feed back into outcomes for the contracting?
So right now, we're actually negotiating what that outcome would look like. But we're
so
focused.
Tell us now.
Okay, well, yeah. So we're focused on the primary endpoint in our clinical trial, which was survival. It's a very hard measure. It's easy to monitor, and but we're in other discussions with the payers to see if we can have additional outcomes as well. But for sure, the primary measure is survival.
Yeah. Again, in this case, I won't be very specific because it is an active negotiation. There's obviously measures around ventilators, neurologic, other drugs, et cetera, which are all part of the discussion. And then the question is, what can we come to agreement on? I always prefer the most robust measures possible, but I've been in so many agreements and so many discussions where you think it's as easy as saying, well, what did you go to the FDA on? And they'll say, well, these are only used in a research setting, or there's no way that this will work once you get into the real world, et cetera. And sometimes you just sit down with the other side and brainstorm. And I'll ask questions like, what happens if it doesn't work, even aside from the FDA utilized measures? An example would be not for gene therapy, but with Alnylam and Onpattro for hereditary TTR amyloidosis. There's a neurologic measure, but I also said, what happens if it doesn't work? And they said, well, they might need a liver transplant. And I said, will you pay for that? And I was only just half kidding. And to my surprise, we have an agreement where they pay up to a max for the a liver transplant, even though that wasn't a measure. So there may be additional things we could put in there that matter, from a quality and financial lens to all the stakeholders. But it is really complicated.
I think nothing, to add specifically there. I think the key is making sure that what we capture in terms of where we think that value equation is as much as possible what we're measuring in the value-based agreement. I think it's really beholden on us to make sure that that value is what was used to drive the value equation in setting the price. And whilst we're not talking about price today, the more we understand what is valuable, that's the outcome that we should be seeking to measure. And if we need to do that in addition to the FDA criteria, I think that will become very important. And again, it's thinking through early in the development process, where is the value going to be added, and thinking through the payer needs and the contractual needs as much as the FDA, even if those things are in parallel.
So in some of the work that we're doing on value-based outcome, it's very clear that the outcomes that would make a lot of sense in terms of patient care aren't really the ones that are in the claims data. And so do we want to reinvent the wheel on data collection or not?
I think that's a great question, something we think about a lot. So some of our initial agreements, or most of them, were things you could easily get from claims data. And we thought that was important for scalability issues. And if you're looking at heart disease, diabetes, and other things, asthma, it probably is really important. However, we're focused now more on the conditions we talked about, rare diseases, which may or may not have a one-time cure, the one-time gene therapy type of treatments, oncology, CAR T, et cetera. And those are relatively small ends with high dollar values. And in those cases, so there could be a couple $100,000 at risk for a given patient. So in that case, it makes financial sense for me as a payer to hire someone if I need to look at that small number of individuals and get data which may not be easily attained from claims. So as our thinking and our focus has evolved, my answer on that has evolved as well. But what I would say is there also are some other things that are happening technology-wise. There are more and more apps that are being used, including with the FDA Sentinel project, which are kind of FDA, caliber approved, which can be used for patient-reported outcomes. There are more and more interconnectivity issues with enablements with EHRs, et cetera. So I think over the next 5 to 10 years, it will get much easier to do that. But you're right, it is and has been something we think about as a constraint.
Technology is going to solve this problem.
Yeah, so I was just going to add that, I think it's important, we're really in early days with this, that the perfect isn't the enemy of the good. And we learn as we do these pilots, and that's exactly the point of it. And I think what John said was a really important comment that I just want to, just add on to, that we have to start thinking about this earlier on, because the goal has always been FDA approval, and then the provider or the payers will come, right? But I think the goal is changing now. It's FDA approval, but then how do we contract successfully with payers to ensure that there's availability of these treatments? And in order to do that, you have to think about potentially measurements differently. The only reliable measures that you can use today, I think, to accurately forecast and to use in a scalable fashion are pharmacy and medical claims data, but we need to move beyond that, and I think everybody knows that, but you have to start somewhere, right? So if you can demonstrate a point and then begin to build the systems that support that, then I think we get data from data fields of electronic medical records and patient-reported outcomes data and other things to begin to fill in on that. But you have to start somewhere.
So it's all, go ahead, I'm sorry.
I'd add but in some cases, that won't work. It depends on the therapeutic area. So take our first gene therapy agreement with Spark for Luxturna, and met with them, and well, I understand you have this obstacle course you've set up, and of course we're going to use that, and they explained that no one ever is going to do it correctly outside of the setting, or once just forget. But what we did agree to was a different measure of visual response that was consistent with that, but that was different. So we, again, that took some sitting down and being creative. But you do need something, even if it's not the same measure, that it gets you to measuring the same component.
It's almost a version of coverage with outcomes development, right? Where the outcomes are going to be some combination of claims, but also other types of technology or other types of data collection.
And I think that's a really important point, because as we see the FDA, for good reasons, try to improve speed to market of drugs for rare diseases. I mean, think about the ultra-orphans. It may be hard, if not impossible, to do a well-controlled clinical trial for some of these. Think about the pace with which evidence is changing for some of the oncology areas, going from organ-based to molecular-based. It makes perfect sense for us to agree with a pharma company. We've had some high-level discussions around the idea exactly that. We'll essentially let this be given to anyone where there might be a chance. Just don't send us a bill if it doesn't work. And that's where they get into things like, well, are we marketing or agreeing off-label, and you run into regulatory issues. But conceptually, I would love to do that.
Yeah, I
Sounds
think,
great.
Michael, building on your point, the key thing there was Spark built that correlation between the regulatory measurement and the practical measurement that you can understand, and that link was built in early in the clinical program, so that there was more comfort with what was being measured, fitted with the FDA and fitted with what you were willing to reimburse.
So unfortunately, we have run out of time in this panel. Fascinating discussion that I expect that my panelists would be happy to discuss afterwards in the break. Please thank them.